Chapter 4. Just at a sight of the farm, the road forks. One way running out into Walton, where you cross the river by a covered bridge. The other swinging down toward Greenbrier and Port Vigor. Mrs. Collins lives a mile or so up Walton Road, and I very often run over to see her. I thought Andrew would be most likely to look for me there. So, after we'd passed through the grove, I took the right-hand turn to Greenbrier. We began a long ascent over Huckleberry Hill. And as I smelt the fresh autumn odor of the leaves, I chuckled a little. Mr. Mifflin seemed in a perfect ecstasy of high spirits. "This is certainly grand," he said. "Lord, I applaud your spunk. Do you think Mr. McGill will give chase?" "I haven't an idea," I said. "Not right away, anyhow. He's so used to my settled ways that I don't think he'll suspect anything till he finds my note. I wonder what kind of story Mrs. McNally will tell." "How about putting him off the scent?" he said. "Give me your handkerchief." I did so. He hopped nimbly out, ran back down the hill. He was a spry little person in spite of his bald crown, and dropped the handkerchief on the Walton Road about 100 feet beyond the fork. Then he followed me up the slope. "There," he said, grinning like a kid. "That'll fool him. The sage of Redfield will undoubtedly follow a false spoor, and the criminals will win a good start. But I'm afraid it's rather easy to follow a craft as unusual as Parnassus." "Tell me how you manage this thing," I said. "Do you really make it pay?" He halted at the top of the hill to give Pegasus a breathing space. The terrier lay down in the dust and watched us gravely. Mr. Mifflin pulled out a pipe and begged my permission to smoke. "It's rather comical how I first got into it," he said. "I was a schoolteacher down in Maryland. I'd been plugging away in a country school for years, a starvation salary. I was trying to support an invalid mother and put by something in case of storms. I remember how I used to wonder whether I'd ever be able to wear a suit that wasn't shabby and have my shoes polished every day. Then my health went back on me. The doctor told me to get into the open air. By and by, I got this idea of a traveling bookstore. I'd always been a lover of books, and in the days when I boarded out among the farmers, I used to read aloud to them. After my mother died, I built a wagon to suit my own ideas, bought a stock of books from a big second-hand store in Baltimore, and set out. Parnassus just about saved my life, I guess." He pushed his faded old cap back on his head and relit his pipe. I clicked to Pegasus and we rumbled gently off over the upland, looking down across the pastures. Distant cowbells sounded tankle-tonk against the bushes. Among the slope of the hill, I could see the road winding away to Redfield. Somewhere along the road, Andrew would be rolling back towards home, roast pork and applesauce. And here was I, setting out on the first madness of my life, without even a qualm. "Miss McGill," said the little man, "this rolling pavilion has been wife, doctor, and religion to me for 7 years. A month ago, I would have scoffed at the thought of leaving her, but somehow it's come over me I need a change. There's a book I've been yearning to write for a long time, and I need a desk steady under my elbows, and a roof over my head. And silly as it seems, I'm crazy to get back to Brooklyn. My brother and I used to live there as kids. Think of walking out over the old bridge at sunset and seeing the towers of Manhattan against a red sky, and those old gray cruisers down in the Navy Yard. You don't know how tickled I am to sell out. I've sold a lot of copies of your brother's books, and I've often thought he'd be the man to buy Parnassus if I got tired of her." "So he would," I said. "Just the man. He'd be only too likely to go motoring about in this jaunting car and neglect the farm." "But tell me about selling books. How much profit do you make out of it? We'll be passing Mrs. Mason's farm by and by, and we might as well sell her something, just to make a start." "It's very simple," he said. I replenish my stock whenever I go into a big town. There's always a second-hand bookstore somewhere about. You can pick up odds and ends. And every now and then I write to a wholesaler in New York for some stuff. When I buy a book, I mark it in the back just what I paid for it, then I know what I can afford to sell it for. See here. He pulled up a book from behind the seat, a copy of Lorna Doone it was, and showed me the letters A.M. scrawled in pencil in the back. That means that I paid 10 cents for this. Now, if you sell it for a quarter, you've got a safe profit. Cost me about $4 a week to run Parnassus, generally less. If you clear that much in 6 days, you can afford to lay off on Sundays. How do you know what AM stands for 10 cents? I asked. The code words manuscript. Each letter stands for a figure from 0 up to 9, see? He scrawled it down on a piece of paper. Manuscript, and then beneath it, 0 to 9. Now you see, AM stands for 10. AN would be 12. NS is 24. AC is 15. And then AMM is $1, and so on. I don't pay much over 50 cents for books as a rule, because country folks are shy of paying much for them. They'll pay a lot for a separator or a buggy top, but they've never been taught to worry about literature. But it's surprising how excited they get about books if you tell them the right kind. Over beyond Port Vigor, there's a farmer who's waiting for me to go back. I've been there 3 or 4 times. He'll buy about $5 worth if I know him. First time I went there, I sold him Treasure Island, and he's talking about it yet. I sold him Robinson Crusoe and Little Women for his daughter, Huck Finn, and Grubb's book about the potato. Last time I was there, he wanted some Shakespeare. But I wouldn't give it to him. I didn't think he was up to it yet. I began to see something of the little man's idealism in his work. He was a kind of traveling missionary in his way, a hefty talker, too. His eyes were twinkling now, and I could see him warming up. Lord, he said, when you sell a man a book, you don't sell him just 12 ounces of paper and ink and glue. You sell him a whole new life, love and friendship and humor and ships by sea at night. There's all heaven and earth in a book, a real book, I mean. Jiminy, if I were the baker or the butcher or the broom huckster, people would run to the gate when I came by, just waiting for my stuff. And here I go loaded with everlasting salvation. Yes, ma'am, salvation for their little stunted minds, and it's hard to make 'em see it. That's what makes it worthwhile. I'm doing something that nobody else from Nazareth, Maine to Walla Walla, Washington has ever thought of. It's a new field, but by the bones of Whitman, it's worthwhile, and that's what the country needs. More books. He laughed out his own vehemence. Do you know, it's comical, he said. Even the publishers, the fellows that print the books, can't see what I'm doing for 'em. Some of them refuse me credit because I will sell their books for what they're worth, instead of the prices they mark on them. They write me letters about price maintenance, and I write back about merit maintenance. Publish a good book and I'll get a good price for it, say I. Sometimes I think the publishers know less about the books than anyone else. I guess that's natural, though. Most school teachers don't know much about children. The best of it is this, he went on. I have such a darn good time. Peg and Bach, that's the dog, and I go loafing along the road on a warm summer day. By and by we'll fetch up alongside some boarding house, and there all the boarders are rocking off their lunches on the veranda. Most of 'em bored to death, nothing good to read, nothing to do but sit and watch flies buzzing in the sun and the chickens rubbing up and down in the dust. First thing you know, I'll sell 6 books, put the love of life into them, and they don't forget Parnassus in a hurry. Take O. Henry, for instance. There isn't anybody so doggone sleepy that he won't enjoy that man's stories. He understood life, you bet. And he could write it down with all its little twists. I spent an evening reading O. Henry and Wilkie Collins to people, and had them buy out all their books I had, and clamor for more. What do you do in the winter? I asked, a practical question, as most of mine are. That depends on where I am when bad weather sets in, said Mr. Mifflin. 2 winters I was down south and managed to keep Parnassus going all through the season. Otherwise, I just lay up wherever I am. I never found it hard to get lodging for Peg and a job for myself, if I had to have 'em. Last winter I worked in a bookstore in Boston. Winter before I was in a country drugstore down in Pennsylvania. Winter before that I tutored a couple of small boys in English literature. Winter before that I was a steward on a steamer. You see how it goes. I've had a fairly miscellaneous experience. As far as I can see, a man who's fond of books never need starve. This winter I'm planning on living with my brother in Brooklyn and slog away at my book. Lord, how I pondered over that thing. Long summer afternoons I've sat there jogging in the dust, thinking it out until it seemed as if my forehead would burst. You see? My idea is that the common people, in the country that is, never had any chance to get hold of books, and never have anyone to explain what books mean. It's all right for college presidents to drop their 5-foot shelves of great literature, for publishers to advertise sets of the linoleum classics, but what the people need is the good, homely, honest stuff, something that'll stick to their ribs, make 'em laugh and tremble and feel sick to think of the littleness of this popcorn ball spinning in space without ever getting into a hot box. And something that'll spur 'em on to keep the hearth well swept and the woodpile split into kindling and the dishes washed and dried and put away. Anyone who can get the country people to read something worthwhile is doing the nation a real service. And that's what this caravan of culture aspires to. You must be weary of this harangue. Does the sage of Redfield ever run on like that? Not to me, I said. He's known me so long that he thinks of me as a kind of animated bread-baking and cake-mixing machine. I guess he doesn't put much stock in my judgment in literary matters. But he puts his digestion in my hands without reserve. There's Mason's farm over there. I guess we better sell him some books, hadn't we? Just for a starter. He turned into the lane that runs up to the Mason farmhouse. Bach trotted on ahead, very stiff on his legs, his tail gently wagging, to interview the mastiff, and Mrs. Mason, who was sitting on the porch peeling potatoes, laid down the pan. She's a big buxom woman with jolly brown eyes like a cow's. "For heaven's sake, Miss McGill," she called out in a cheerful voice, "I'm glad to see you. Got a lift, did you?" She hadn't really noticed the inscription on Parnassus and thought it was a regular huckster's wagon. "Well, Mrs. Mason," I said, "I've gone into the book business. This is Mr. Mifflin. I've bought out his stock. We've come to sell you some books." She laughed. "Go on, Helen," she said. "You can't kid me. I bought a whole set of books last year from an agent. The World's Great Funeral Orations. 20 volumes. Sam and I ain't read more'n the first volume yet, and it's awful uneasy reading." Mifflin jumped down, raised the side flap of the wagon. Mrs. Mason came closer. I was tickled to see how the little man perked up at the sight of a customer. Evidently selling books was meat and drink to him. "Madam," he said, "funeral orations bound in sackcloth, I suppose, have their place. But Miss McGill and I have got some real books here to show, which I invite your attention. Winter will be here soon, and you will need something more cheerful to beguile your evenings. Very possibly you have growing children who would profit by a book or two. A book of fairy tales for the little girl I see on the porch, or stories of inventors for that boy's about to break his neck jumping from the barn loft, or a book about road making for your husband. Surely there's something here you need. Miss McGill probably knows your tastes." That little red-bearded man was surely a born salesman. How he guessed that Mr. Mason was a road commissioner in our township, goodness only knows. Perhaps it was just a lucky shot. By this time most of the family had gathered around the van, and I saw Mr. Mason coming from the barn with his 12-year-old Billy. "Sam," shouted Mrs. Mason. "Here, Miss McGill turned book peddler and got a preacher with her." "Hello, Miss McGill," said Mr. Mason. He's a big, slow-moving man of great gravity and solidity. "Where's Andrew?" "Andrew's coming home for roast pork and applesauce," I said. "I'm going off to sell books for a living. Mr. Mifflin is teaching me how. We've got a book on road mending. That's just what you need." I saw Mr. and Mrs. Mason exchange glances. Evidently, they thought me crazy. I began to wonder whether he'd made a mistake in calling on people I knew so well. The situation was a trifle embarrassing. Mr. Mifflin came to the rescue. "Don't be alarmed, sir," he said to Mr. Mason. "I haven't kidnapped Miss McGill." Is he about half my size? This was amusing. "We're trying to increase her brother's income by selling his books for him. As a matter of fact, we have a wager with him that we can sell 50 copies of Happiness and Hayseed before Halloween. Now, I'm sure your sporting instinct will assist us in taking at least one copy. Andrew McGill is probably the greatest author in this state, and every taxpayer ought to possess his books. May I show you a copy?" "That sounds reasonable," said Mr. Mason, and he almost smiled. "What do you say, Emma? Think we better buy a book or two? You know those funeral orations?" "Well," said Emma, we always said we ought to read one of Andrew McGill's books, but we didn't rightly know how to get a hold of one. That fellow that sold us the funeral speeches didn't seem to know about 'em. I tell you what, you folks better stop and have dinner with us, and you can tell us what we'd ought to buy. I'm just ready to put potatoes on the stove now." I must confess that the prospect of sitting down to a meal I hadn't cooked myself appealed to me strongly, and I was keen to see what kind of grub Mrs. Mason provided for her household. But I was afraid if we dallied too long there, Andrew would be after us. I was about to say that we should have to be getting on, and couldn't stay, but apparently the zest of expounding his philosophy to the new listeners was too much for Mr. Mifflin. I heard him saying, "That's mighty kind of you, Mrs. Mason, and we'd very much like to stay. Perhaps I can put Peg up in your barn for a while. Then we can tell you all about our books." And to my amazement, I found myself chiming in with assent. Mifflin certainly surpassed himself at dinner. The fact that Mrs. Mason's hot biscuits tasted of saleratus gave me far less satisfaction than it otherwise would, because I was absorbed in listening to the little vagabonds talk. Mr. Mason came to the table grumbling something about his telephone being out of order. I wondered whether he'd been trying to get Andrew on the wire. I was a little afraid that I was being run away with, I think. But he was soon won over by the current of the little man's cheery wit. Nothing daunted Mifflin. He talked to the old grandmother about quilts, offered to cut off a strip of his necktie for her new patchwork, told all about the illustrated book of quilts he had in the van. He discussed cookery and the Bible with Mrs. Mason, and she, being a leading light in the Greenbrier Sunday School, was pleasantly scandalized by his account of the best detective stories in the Old Testament. With Mr. Mason, he was all scientific farming, chemical manures, macadam rows, crop rotation, and to little Billy, who sat next to him, he told extraordinary yarns about Daniel Boone, Davy Crockett, Kit Carson, Buffalo Bill, and what not. Honestly, I was amazed at the little man. He was as genial as a cricket on a hearth. And yet every now and then his earnestness would break through. I don't wonder he was a success at selling books. That man could sell clothespins or Paris garters, I guess, and make them seem romantic. "You know, Mr. Mason," he said, "you certainly owe it to these youngsters of yours to put a few really good books into their hands. City kids have the libraries to go to, but in the country there's only old Doc Hostletter's almanac, and the letters written by ladies with backache telling you Peruna did it for 'em. Give this boy and girl of yours a few good books, and you're starting 'em on a double-track, block signal line to happiness. Now here's Little Women. That girl of yours can learn more about real girlhood and fine womanhood out of that book than from a year's paper dolls in the attic." "That's right, Pa," assented Mrs. Mason. Go on with your meal, Professor. The meat'll get cold. She was completely won by the traveling bookseller and given him the highest title of honor in her ken. Well, I read that story when I was a girl, and I still remember it. That's better reading for Dorothy than those funeral speeches, I reckon. I believe the professor's right. We ought to have more books laying around. Seems kind of a shame, with a famous author at the next farm, not to read more. Don't it now? So by the time we got down to Mrs. Mason's squash pie, good pie too, I admit, but her hand is a little heavy for pastry. The whole household was enthusiastic about books, and the atmosphere was literary enough for even Dr. Elliot to live in without panting. Mrs. Mason opened up her parlor, and we sat while Mifflin recited The Revenge and Maud Muller. Well now, ain't that real sweet, said Emma Mason. It's surprising how those words rhyme so nicely. Seems almost as if though it was done on purpose. Reminds me of a piece day at school. There was a mighty pretty piece I learned called Wreck of the Asperus, and she subsided into a genteel melancholy. I saw that Mr. Mifflin was well astride his hobby. He had started to tell the children about Robin Hood, but I had the sense to give him a wink. We had to be getting along, or surely Andrew might be on us. So while Mifflin was putting Pegasus into the shafts again, I picked out 7 or 8 books that I thought would fit the needs of the Masons. Mr. Mason insisted that Happiness and Hayseed be included among them. Gave me a crisp $5 bill, refusing any change. No, he said, I've had more fun than I get at a Grange meeting. Come round again, Miss McGill. I'm going to tell Andrew what a good show this traveling theatre of yours gives. And you, Professor, any time you're here about roadmen season, stop in and tell me some more good advice. Well, I must be getting back to the field. Bach fell in under the van, and we creaked on down the lane. Mifflin filled his pipe and was chuckling to himself. I was a little worried now for fear Andrew might overtake us. It's a wonder Sam Mason didn't call up Andrew, I said. It must have looked quite queer to him for an old farmhand like me to be around peddling books. But he would have done it straight off, said Mifflin. But you see, I cut his telephone wire.